You ever notice how some people seem to handle money effortlessly? Not in that flashy, Instagram rich kind of way, more like they just never seem stressed about it. They're not constantly checking their bank balance before buying groceries. They're not panicking when the car makes that weird noise. They're just calm. And meanwhile, you're out here doing everything the internet tells you to do. You're tracking every expense in some app. You're reading articles about side hustles. You're cutting back on things you actually enjoy because someone said that's what responsible people do. But somehow, at the end of every month, you're still in the same place. Maybe a little ahead if you're lucky. Maybe a little behind if something unexpected happened. Here's what nobody tells you. The people who build lasting wealth aren't doing something complicated. They're not smarter than you. They don't have some secret investment strategy that only works if you went to business school. What they have is something much simpler, much more boring, and infinitely more powerful. They have a system, not a budget, not a goal. A system that runs automatically, that doesn't require constant willpower or decision making, that works the same whether you're making $40,000 or $400,000 a year. My name's Anderson, and I spent the better part of a decade trying to understand why some people build wealth while others people working just as hard, sometimes harder, never seem to get ahead. And what I found isn't what I expected. The difference isn't about how much you earn, it's about what happens to your money in the first 48 hours after you get paid. That's it. That's the whole game. Everything else is just details. Here's what most people believe about managing money. They think it's about control, about discipline, about constantly monitoring what you're spending and feeling guilty when you buy something you didn't plan for, about turning life into this exhausting math problem where every purchase needs to be justified. And that belief is exactly why most people fail. Because here's what actually happens when you try to manage money through pure willpower. You succeed for a while. Maybe a month, maybe 3. You're diligent, you're tracking everything. You feel virtuous and responsible. And then life happens. Your friend gets married, your laptop dies. You just have a really terrible week and decide you deserve something nice. And suddenly all that careful tracking falls apart and you're back where you started, except now you also feel like a failure. The wealthy understand something fundamental that changes everything. Willpower is a terrible foundation for any system that needs to last decades. You can't white-knuckle your way to financial security. You'll burn out every time. What you need instead is a system that makes the right decisions automatic. That takes your money and routes it to the right places before you even have the chance to spend it wrong. That works whether you're feeling motivated or not, whether you're paying attention or not, whether you're having a good month or a terrible one. This is the invisible threshold that separates people who build wealth from people who don't. It's not about how much money they have, it's about whether their money moves through a system or through their emotions. When your money moves through your emotions, you're constantly making decisions. Should I save this? Can I afford that? Is this purchase justified? Every decision drains a little bit of mental energy, and eventually, you make the wrong call. Not because you're weak or undisciplined, but because you're human. When your money moves through a system, those decisions are already made. The money goes where it needs to go, and what's left over is yours to use however you want, completely guilt-free. No tracking required, no shame, no constant mental math about whether you can afford something. This shift from managing money with your brain to managing it with a system is what actually separates the wealthy from everyone else. So let me show you what that system looks like, because it's shockingly simple, almost disappointingly simple, the kind of simple that makes you wonder why nobody explained it this way before. Every dollar that comes into your life gets divided into 3 categories before you touch it. Not after you pay your bills, not after you see what's left over, before. Automatically. Without thinking. 70% goes to living your actual life. 20% goes to building your future. 10% goes to protecting yourself from chaos. That's it. That's the entire formula. Now I know what you're thinking. This sounds like just another budget, just another way of telling you what you can and can't spend, but it's not. And the difference matters more than you realize. A budget is a plan you have to follow. A system is a structure that follows you. A budget requires constant attention and discipline. A system runs in the background while you focus on literally anything else. Let me show you how this works in practice and why each of these numbers exists for a specific psychological reason. That 20% that goes to building your future, this is the part that most people get backwards. They treat saving like something they do with whatever's left over at the end of the month. But there's never anything left over at the end of the month. There's always another expense, another reason to spend, another thing that feels more urgent than your future self's problems. The wealthy flip this completely. Your future gets paid first, not because future you is more important than present you, but because future you has zero ability to advocate for themselves. Future you can't send you a text saying, "Hey, I really need you to save more this month." Future you is completely dependent on present you making good decisions, and present you is terrible at thinking about the future. So you remove the decision entirely. 20% of every dollar goes straight to investments before you see it, before you can spend it, before you can talk yourself out of it. And here's why that specific number matters. 20% is enough to build substantial wealth over time, but not so much that it makes your current life miserable. It's the Goldilocks zone of saving. Less than that, and you're building too slowly. More than that, and most people can't sustain it. But here's what makes this truly powerful. That 20% isn't sitting in a savings account earning nothing. It's working. It's invested in funds that track the overall economy. And over time, that money starts earning its own money. Let me show you what this looks like with numbers that'll change how you think about starting early. Imagine you're 30 years old and you start putting 20% of a $50,000 income into investments. That's $10,000 a year, or roughly $830 a month. At historical market returns, let's say 8% annually, which is actually conservative. Here's what happens. By the time you're 40, you've contributed $100,000, but your account doesn't have $100,000 in it. It has closer to $156,000. The extra $56,000 appeared from nowhere. From time, from compound growth. By 50, you've contributed $200,000 total. Your account has roughly $349,000. That's $149,000 you didn't contribute, money that materialized because earlier money made more money. By 60, you've put in $300,000 over your career. Your account is worth roughly $789,000. Nearly $500,000 that you never touched, never thought about, never contributed. It just grew because you started early and stayed consistent. This is why that 20% goes out first. Not because you're disciplined or responsible, but because compound growth rewards time more than it rewards anything else. Every year you wait to start costs you exponentially more than the contribution itself. Now, let's talk about that 10% that goes to protecting yourself from chaos, because this is the part that most financial advice completely ignores. Life doesn't happen on a spreadsheet. You can plan perfectly, budget carefully, make all the right decisions, and then your transmission fails, or you need an emergency root canal, or your company downsizes and you're suddenly unemployed. These things aren't rare. They're inevitable. And if you're not prepared for them, they destroy all your other progress. This is where most people end up in debt, not because they're irresponsible or bad with money, but because they had no buffer between their life and catastrophe. When something breaks, they put it on a credit card. When an opportunity requires upfront cash, they can't take it. When job loss happens, they're immediately desperate. The 10% changes this completely. Every month, 10% of your income goes into an account you don't touch unless something genuinely unexpected happens. Not, "I forgot my sister's birthday was this month," unexpected. Not, "There's a sale on those shoes I wanted," unexpected. Real, actual emergencies. At first, this fund feels small and kind of pointless. 10% of a $50,000 income is about $400 a month. After 3 months, you have $1,200, which might cover a minor car repair but doesn't feel particularly substantial. But here's where the psychology shifts. After 6 months, you have almost 2,500. After a year, you have roughly 5,000. And $5,000 is the threshold where emergencies stop feeling like catastrophes and start feeling like problems you can solve. Your car breaks down? Annoying, but you handle it. Medical bill that insurance won't cover? You pay it and move on. You get laid off? You have breathing room to find something good instead of taking the first offer out of desperation. This 10% doesn't earn returns like your investments. It just sits there boring and accessible, waiting for chaos. But what it's actually buying you is something much more valuable than returns. It's buying you the ability to make decisions from stability instead of panic. And that brings us to the 70%. This is the part that actually makes this system sustainable because it's permission to live your life without guilt. 70% of your income is yours. For rent, for food, for going out with friends, for buying things you want, for spontaneous decisions, for being human. You don't track it, you don't justify it, you don't feel guilty about it because you've already handled your future and your stability. What's left is legitimately yours to spend. This psychological permission is what makes the entire system work long term. Most financial advice treats spending like a moral failure. Every purchase becomes this exhausting negotiation with yourself about whether you really need it, whether you deserve it, whether this is a responsible choice. That's not sustainable. Eventually, you rebel against your own restrictions, and when you do, it's usually catastrophic. You don't just buy the thing you wanted, you blow up your entire budget because you're exhausted from constant deprivation. The 70% prevents this. You're not depriving yourself, you're not sacrificing. You're living a full life with the money that's available after you've handled your priorities. The guilt disappears because there's nothing to feel guilty about. This money is yours. Use it however you want. But here's the subtle genius of this approach. 70% becomes a container. When you know that's all you have to work with, you make better decisions naturally. Not because you're tracking every expense, but because you understand boundaries. You choose housing that fits within that 70%. You choose transportation that fits. You make lifestyle decisions that fit. Not out of deprivation, but out of design. You're creating a life that's sustainable within the resources available, and that distinction changes everything. Now, here's where most people stumble, and it's not where you'd expect. The system itself is simple. Almost everyone who hears this formula agrees it makes sense, but implementation is where things fall apart, and it usually falls apart in one of two ways. The first way is trying to implement it perfectly from day one. You're currently spending 95% of your income just to survive, and you read about this system and think, okay, starting next month, I'll do the 70-20-10 split exactly. And then next month arrives and reality hits, and you realize you can't actually afford to save 20% yet because you're still recovering from previous mistakes or living in a genuinely expensive situation or dealing with circumstances that make that split impossible right now. So you give up entirely. If you can't do it perfectly, why bother doing it at all? This is backwards. The wealthy didn't start at 70-20-10. They started wherever they could start and adjusted over time. If you can only do 85-10-5 right now, start there. If you can only do 95-5-0, start there. The specific numbers matter less than developing the habit of directing your money intentionally instead of letting it disappear into whatever feels most urgent today. The second way people fail is treating the formula like it's rigid across all income levels. They hear 70% for living expenses and think, well, that's fine if you make a lot of money, but I'm barely surviving on what I make now. But here's what they're missing. This system scales. If you're making $30,000, 70% is $21,000 to live on. If you're making $300,000, 70% is $210,000. The percentages stay the same. the lifestyle you can afford with that 70% obviously changes dramatically. This is actually the system's greatest strength. When you get a raise, when you switch jobs, when your income increases in any way, the system automatically adjusts. You're not recalculating everything. You're not renegotiating with yourself about how much to save. The splits stay the same. The dollar amounts increase. And your lifestyle improves gradually without consuming all your growth. Let me show you how this plays out over time, because the long-term effects are where this gets really interesting. Most people experience their income growing throughout their career. Maybe you start at 40,000 in your 20s. By your 30s, you're making 60. By your 40s, maybe 80 or more. That's normal career progression for a lot of people. Without a system, here's what typically happens. As income rises, spending rises to match it. The person making 80,000 somehow feels just as financially stressed as they did making 40,000 because they've upgraded their entire life. Nicer apartment, newer car, more expensive habits, more discretionary spending that becomes non-negotiable routine. They look at their bank account and wonder where all the money went. They're earning twice what they used to make, but they're not actually any wealthier. They've just inflated their lifestyle to consume the additional income. With the 70-20-10 system, something completely different happens. As income grows, the lifestyle improves proportionally, but so does everything else. The 20% going to investments grows, the 10% cushion grows, you're living better and building wealth simultaneously. Let's use actual numbers. Someone making 40,000 who implements this system has 8,000 going to investments annually, 4,000 going to protection, and 28,000 to live on. That same person 5 years later making 60,000 has 12,000 going to investments, 6,000 to protection, and 42,000 to live on. Their lifestyle improved by 14,000 annually. That's substantial, but they're also saving 50% more and have a larger cushion. Another 5 years making 80,000, 16,000 to investments, 8,000 to protection, 56,000 to live. Their lifestyle is twice as expensive as when they started, but they're also building wealth more than twice as fast. This is the compounding effect that most people never experience because they let income growth translate entirely into lifestyle growth. And here's where the identity shift happens that separates people who build wealth from people who just earn money. When you first implement this system, it feels artificial. You're forcing your money to move in specific directions, and it requires conscious effort to maintain those boundaries. You're aware of the system, you're thinking about it, you're making sure it's working, but after 6 months, something changes. After a year, it's even more pronounced. The system stops being something you're doing and starts being something you are. You stop thinking, I'm someone who saves 20%. You just think, this is how money works. The split becomes invisible background structure instead of conscious effort. You don't feel like you're sacrificing or being responsible, you just feel normal. And that's when everything accelerates. Because you're no longer spending mental energy maintaining the system, you're not using willpower to save money. You're not negotiating with yourself about whether this month is different. The money just moves automatically, and you build wealth as a side effect of living normally. This identity shift is what makes wealth sustainable. You're not performing responsibility or playing at being good with money. You've become someone who handles money well, and that distinction is permanent. People notice this change, though they usually can't articulate what's different. You show up differently at work, you make decisions differently, you have this quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're building something instead of just reacting to life. Now let's talk about what this feels like when life throws something at you, because that's where the psychological difference becomes most obvious. Imagine your car needs a $1,500 repair. For most people, this triggers immediate stress. Can they afford it? Do they have to put it on a credit card? Should they try to postpone the repair and hope it doesn't get worse? With the 70-20-10 system, this scenario plays out completely differently. You check your emergency fund. You have $6,000 sitting there. The $1,500 is annoying, but it's not a crisis. You're not borrowing. You're not stressing. You're not making desperate decisions. You handle it, maybe you're slightly irritated, and you move on. Or imagine your company announces layoffs and you're affected. For most people, this is catastrophic. They have maybe 2 or 3 weeks of expenses saved, and the panic is immediate. They apply for anything, they take the first offer, they make decisions from desperation. With this system, you have months of expenses in your emergency fund. Your investments are still growing. You have time to think strategically about what you want next, instead of just what you need immediately. Job loss is still stressful, but it's not existential. You can be selective, you can negotiate, you can even consider this an opportunity to make a career shift you've been thinking about. Same events, completely different emotional experience, not because you're suddenly wealthy, but because you've created space between yourself and financial disaster. Here's something else that happens that most people don't anticipate. The system changes how you think about opportunities. When someone tells you about a business idea or a certification that could advance your career or an investment opportunity that requires capital, you stop automatically saying no. You start evaluating whether it's actually a good idea instead of whether you can afford it. Most people miss opportunities not because they don't recognize them, but because they're not in a position to act on them. They don't have the capital. They can't take the risk. They're too financially fragile to bet on anything that isn't guaranteed. With the 70-20-10 system, you develop capacity. Not infinite capacity, you're not rich, but real, meaningful capacity to take calculated risks when something genuinely promising appears. Your friend wants to start a business and needs investors? You can consider it. A professional certification that costs $3,000 but could lead to a promotion? You can do it without it destroying your budget. A chance to buy into real estate with some colleagues? You have the capital to evaluate whether it makes sense. This isn't about having lots of money. It's about having enough structure that you can be flexible when it matters. But here's the warning that I need you to hear clearly, because this is where most people sabotage themselves. The first time you see your emergency fund hit 10,000, or your investments cross 50,000, or you get a particularly large bonus, there's this temptation. This voice that says, you've been responsible for so long, you deserve to celebrate, you've earned this. And maybe you decide to take that vacation you've been postponing, or upgrade your car, or renovate your apartment, something that feels like a reward for all the discipline you've shown. And just like that, you're back at zero in your emergency fund, or you've pulled 20,000 from investments and reset your compound growth timeline. Or you've increased your fixed costs permanently, and now that 70% doesn't cover your lifestyle anymore. This is the trap. The system isn't a punishment you endure until you have enough money to stop. The system is how you build wealth. Period. There's no finish line where you get to abandon it. The numbers grow, but the percentages stay the same. That emergency fund isn't a savings goal you achieve and then spend. It's infrastructure. Permanent infrastructure that protects everything else you're building. Those investments aren't a prize you've won. They're a foundation that grows more valuable every year you leave them alone. The wealthy understand this instinctively. They don't see reaching 100,000 as achievement, they see it as ammunition. The system that got them there is the same system that'll get them to 1,000,000. Nothing changes except the numbers. Let me show you one final piece that makes this all click into place, the opportunity cost of breaking the system. Let's say you've built up 30,000 in investments through this system. You're proud of that. It took discipline and time. And then you decide you want a new car and you think, well, I could take 10,000 from my investments as a down payment and finance the rest. That 10,000 removal seems reasonable in the moment. You're not emptying the account. You're still leaving 20,000 invested. And you really do need a more reliable car, or at least a car that doesn't embarrass you. But here's what you actually did. You took 10,000 that would have grown to roughly 46,000 over 20 years, and you traded it for a car that'll be worth maybe 3,000 in 20 years. You didn't spend 10,000. You spent 43,000 in future value plus a completely depreciated vehicle. Every time you break the system for something that feels justified in the present, you're making this trade, present gratification for exponentially larger future resources. And your brain is terrible at evaluating these trades honestly because the future value feels abstract while the present desire feels immediate and real. The wealthy run this calculation instinctively before every major decision, not obsessively, not frantically, just naturally. They ask, what am I actually trading here? And often, once you see the real trade off, the present desire becomes less compelling. So here's where we end up. The 70-20-10 system isn't magic. It's not a secret that only wealthy people know. It's just basic mathematics wrapped in behavioral psychology, implemented consistently over time. Most people will hear this and think, yeah, that makes sense, and then continue doing exactly what they've always done. Because implementing a system requires changing something, and changing anything is uncomfortable even when you know it's right. But some people, maybe you will actually do this. You'll set up the automatic transfers, you'll restructure your life to fit within 70%, you'll protect that 20% like it's sacred, and you'll build that 10% cushion that changes how uncertainty feels. And 20 years from now, you'll be sitting somewhere comfortable, making decisions based purely on what you want to do rather than what you can afford, and you'll barely remember what it felt like to live any other way. You won't feel like you sacrificed your 20s or 30s to build wealth. You'll have lived fully within that 70%. You'll have taken vacations, enjoyed meals with friends, bought things you wanted, but you'll have done it within a structure that simultaneously built your future. And the beautiful part, that future self won't remember this moment as some massive decision that changed everything. They'll just remember this as the moment when money stopped being stressful and started being boring, which is exactly what it should be. Your money doesn't need to be exciting. It doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs to work. And this system works whether you're paying attention or not, whether you're motivated or not, whether you're having a good year or a difficult one. The only question is whether you'll implement it or spend the next decade wishing you had. Your future self is waiting. They can't advocate for themselves. They can't make this decision. Only present you can do that. And 20 years from now, when that future self looks back on this exact moment, they're going to be grateful. Not because you did something extraordinary, but because you did something simple, consistently, for long enough that it mattered.